There are people you remember because they changed your life, and then there are the rare ones you remember because they changed the way your mind works. Most people think influence is loud, a conversation, a confession, a moment that divides life into before and after. They're wrong. Real influence is almost invisible. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives like a small inconsistency inside your own thinking. One day you notice that your conclusions don't end where they used to. Your questions become different. Your silence starts carrying weight it never carried before. Nothing dramatic has happened, nothing anyone else could point at, yet something fundamental has shifted. I never believed another person could reach that place, not because I underestimated people, because I understood how carefully the mind protects its foundation. We build identities the same way architects build cities, lot due after layer. Every belief supported by another belief beneath it. Every habit protecting another habit underneath. Every certainty standing on thousands of unnoticed decisions. It looks effortless from the outside. It never is. That's why real change is so rare. You don't simply replace a thought. You replace the structure that allowed that thought to exist. Most people never touch that structure. They argue with opinions. They react to behavior. They respond to words. Almost nobody reaches the architecture beneath them. And honestly, I preferred it that way. It meant I could remain unchanged while everyone believed they knew me. People often mistake familiarity for understanding. Spend enough time around someone, and they begin believing they've discovered who you are. But repetition isn't understanding. Routine isn't awareness. Predictability isn't depth. Knowing what someone usually says is very different from knowing why silence sometimes says more than speech ever could. That's where almost everyone stops. Servigi patterns, visible habits, expected reactions. They become experts in observation while remaining strangers to meaning. I stopped expecting anything deeper years ago, not because deeper connections don't exist, because they're expensive. They require attention most people no longer possess. Attention without distraction, curiosity without ownership, presence without agenda. Those things have become rare. Everyone wants conclusions. Very few want discovery, which is why something about this feels impossible. You never seemed interested in reaching conclusions. You were comfortable remaining inside uncertainty. Most people panic when answers disappear. You didn't. You allowed unanswered things to remain unanswered. That sounds simple. It isn't. The human mind hates open loops. It searches desperately for labels because labels create control. Call something friendship, call it admiration, call it coincidence, call it chemistry. Once it has a name, people relax. Names create the illusion that mystery has ended. But reality doesn't care what we call it. Reality remains exactly what it is, whether language catches up or not. Maybe that's what I noticed first. You weren't trying to reduce anything. You weren't trying to explain me back to myself. You weren't collecting pieces so you could build a comfortable story. You simply let reality remain larger than explanation. That takes discipline. Most people can't resist simplifying what confuses them. It's easier than admitting they don't fully understand. But understanding isn't the same as certainty. In fact, sometimes the deepest understanding begins where certainty ends. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it impressed me, because it exposed something about myself. I realized how often I had mistaken control for wisdom. If I could explain something, I believed I understood it. If I could organize it, I believed I had mastered it. If I could predict it, I believed it no longer had power over me. Then you appeared, not to challenge those beliefs, simply by existing beyond them. You couldn't be summarized. Not because you were complicated, because you never behaved like someone trying to become understandable. There was an honesty in that, an unusual kind. Most honesty isn't honesty. It's performance disguised as vulnerability. People reveal carefully selected pieces of themselves, hoping those pieces create a specific impression. Even authenticity becomes strategy. But strategy always leaves fingerprints. Eventually you notice the performance. Eventually you see the intention hiding beneath every sentence. I kept looking for yours. I never found it. Not because it wasn't there, because there wasn't one. You weren't trying to become anything. Not impressive, not mysterious, not unforgettable. And strangely, that made you all three. The mind pays attention to what doesn't demand attention. It always has. A single quiet voice in a crowded room eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Not because it's louder, because everything else becomes noise around it. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe I spent so much time surrounded by predictable conversations that genuine presence felt unfamiliar, or maybe it wasn't unfamiliar at all. Maybe it was something I had forgotten existed. There's an important difference. Forgetting something doesn't erase it. It simply removes your ability to recognize it immediately. Then one unexpected moment arrives. And memory returns without warning. Not memory of events, memory of possibility. The possibility that another mind can exist beside yours without trying to compete with it, without trying to convince it, without trying to reshape it, just beside it. Equal, present, aware. That's an experience language struggles to describe because language was designed for objects, not awareness. You can describe a mountain, a city, a face. You can even describe emotions with enough patience. But awareness? Awareness refuses description. The moment you define it completely, you've already reduced it. That's why I've become careful with words lately. Not because words are unimportant, because they're powerful enough to distort what they're trying to protect. Every sentence leaves something behind. Every explanation sacrifices a piece of accuracy. Sometimes silence preserves truth better than perfect grammar ever could. I used to think silence meant absence. Now I think silence is where reality waits until language catches up. Maybe it never does. Maybe it isn't supposed to. Maybe some things aren't waiting for explanation. They're waiting for recognition. Recognition changes everything. Because recognition doesn't ask for proof. It doesn't demand evidence. It doesn't negotiate. It simply arrives. Clear, undeniable. Quiet. You recognize a face in a crowd before your mind remembers the name. You recognize a melody before you remember where you heard it. You recognize home before you explain why it feels familiar. Recognition always moves faster than logic. Logic arrives afterward, trying to justify what awareness already knew. That's been the strangest part. My mind keeps arriving late. By the time logic begins asking questions, something deeper has already answered them. And I don't entirely know what to do with that. I've trusted reason my entire life. Not because emotion is unreliable, because reason creates distance, distance creates perspective, perspective creates stability. At least, that's what I believed. Now I'm beginning to wonder if too much distance eventually becomes blindness. Because you can't study a sunrise from another country. Some realities require presence, not observation. Presence, there's a difference. Observation keeps you outside the experience. Presence allows the experience to change you. I've spent years observing life, maybe too many, Maybe understanding became another way of avoiding participation. Maybe analysis slowly replaced living without me noticing. If that's true, then meeting you didn't introduce something new. It interrupted something old. And interruptions aren't always destructive. Sometimes they're the only reason we notice the direction we were already moving. Sometimes a pause reveals more than motion ever could. That's where I find myself now. Not searching for answers, not chasing certainty, simply noticing how certain thoughts no longer end where they used to. Noticing how questions have become more valuable than conclusions. Noticing how presence quietly reshapes everything certainty once promised. And for the first time in a very long time, that doesn't feel like losing control. It feels like discovering a part of myself that control never allowed me to meet. If someone watched from a distance, they would probably see ordinary conversations, ordinary pauses, ordinary moments that disappeared as quickly as they arrived. That's the problem with the things that matter most. They rarely leave evidence. People believe transformation should be visible. They expect dramatic decisions, unexpected endings, confessions that divide life into neat chapters. But real transformation doesn't announce itself. It edits you quietly, one invisible adjustment at a time, until one morning you realize you're responding to the world through a perspective you never consciously chose. I've been trying to understand when that process began, not because I want to undo it, because I respect anything capable of changing the foundation without asking permission first. That kind of influence deserves to be understood, not feared, not worshipped, understood. I started paying attention to the smallest details, not your words. Words are unreliable. Anyone can choose them. Anyone can arrange them carefully enough to create almost any impression they want. What interested me was everything surrounding them. The pauses you never tried to hide. The moments you allowed uncertainty to exist, instead of rushing toward confidence. The way you never seemed uncomfortable admitting that something couldn't yet be explained. That fascinated me. Not because uncertainty is attractive, because honesty is. And honest uncertainty is becoming almost impossible to find. Everyone wants to appear certain, even when certainty costs them the truth, especially then. I've noticed something about people. Most aren't afraid of being wrong. They're afraid of being seen while they don't know. There's a difference. Being wrong can be corrected. Not knowing feels exposed, so they pretend. They speak before they've understood. They decide before they've observed. They conclude before they've listened. Eventually, they forget the difference between certainty and repetition. Repeat an idea often enough, and it begins to feel true. Not because it is, because familiarity imitates understanding. I think that's one of the quiet dangers of the human mind. It mistakes comfort for accuracy. It prefers predictable mistakes over uncomfortable truth. Maybe I did the same thing for longer than I realized. Maybe I became comfortable inside my own explanations. Comfortable enough to stop questioning whether they were complete. Then something shifted. Not because someone argued against them. Argument rarely change anything important. People defend themselves harder when challenged directly. No, change usually begins with a question so precise it makes your previous certainty feel slightly unfinished. You became that question, not intentionally. You never tried to dismantle anything. You simply existed in a way my old explanations couldn't fully contain. And once that happened, the explanation stopped feeling complete. Not false, incomplete. That's an important distinction. Growth doesn't always require abandoning what you believed. Sometimes it only requires realizing the picture is larger than the frame you've been using. I've always admired architecture, not buildings themselves, the thinking behind them. A beautiful structure doesn't survive because it's beautiful. It survives because its foundation carries weight no one ever notices. Relationships are similar. Ideas are similar. Even identity works that way. Everyone notices what stands above the ground. Almost nobody studies what keeps it standing. That's where I've been looking lately, at foundations, at invisible structures, at the things people overlook because they aren't immediately visible. It's surprising how much of life exists underneath appearance. Confidence often hides fear. Silence often hides clarity. Noise often hides confusion. Distance sometimes hides affection. Closeness sometimes hides loneliness. The world is rarely what it first appears to be. Maybe that's why certainty has become less interesting to me. Certainty freezes reality into a single shape. Awareness allows it to remain alive. Living things change. Only dead things stay exactly the same forever. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because I realized something uncomfortable. For years, I admired consistency, predictability, stability. But maybe I was admiring stillness more than life itself. Life breathes, it evolves, it surprises itself. Nothing alive remains identical forever. Not rivers, not forests, not mines, not people. So why was I expecting myself to? Why was I protecting an identity that no longer reflected who I was becoming? The answer wasn't difficult, because change creates uncertainty, and uncertainty asks for trust, not trust in another person, trust in your own ability to survive becoming someone different. That's much harder. Most people don't fear losing others. They fear losing the version of themselves they've spent years constructing, even when that version no longer fits. Especially then. Construction takes effort. Letting go feels like waste. But growth has never been efficient. A tree doesn't mourn every leaf that falls. It understands something deeper. Loss isn't always subtraction. Sometimes it's preparation. Maybe minds work the same way. Maybe we aren't meant to preserve every certainty forever. Maybe some beliefs exist only long enough to carry us toward better questions. That possibility changes everything, because suddenly uncertainty isn't failure, it's transition. I've begun noticing transitions everywhere. Day doesn't become night all at once. Winter doesn't wake up as spring. Even oceans reshape coastlines, one patient wave at a time. Nature never rushes becoming. Only humans do. We demand immediate clarity, immediate purpose, immediate certainty, as though reality owes us conclusions before we've earned them. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe some answers arrive only after we've become capable of recognizing them. Not before. That would explain so much. It would explain why timing matters more than information. The same truth can arrive twice. Ignored the first time, life-changing the second. Nothing changed except the person receiving it. Perspective determines everything. And perspective isn't taught, it's lived. That's another thing I've been reconsidering. Experience isn't measured by time. Some people spend decades repeating yesterday. Others live one honest moment that permanently rearranges how they see existence. Depth has never respected calendars. One genuine realization outweighs years of automatic living. Maybe that's why certain conversations stay with us while thousands disappear. Not because they were longer, because they reached somewhere ordinary language rarely touches. Language fascinates me, not because of what it says, because of what it fails to say. The most important parts of communication often exist outside the sentences themselves, in rhythm, in timing, in restraint, in everything deliberately left unsaid. People assume communication means adding information. Sometimes communication means protecting meaning from unnecessary words. I've started speaking less lately, not because I have less to say, because I'm beginning to understand how easily language can interrupt understanding instead of creating it. Silence isn't empty, it's unfinished. There's a difference. Empty things have nothing inside them. Unfinished things contain possibility. Most people rush to finish every silence. Maybe that's why they miss what silence was trying to reveal. I've wondered whether awareness has its own language, not spoken, not written, something quieter, recognition perhaps, presence, attention. Maybe those are words pointing toward something language itself can never fully capture. If that's true, then maybe understanding another person has very little to do with collecting information about them. Maybe understanding begins when you stop trying to complete the picture with your own assumptions. Maybe seeing someone clearly requires removing yourself from the interpretation. That's incredibly difficult. The ego wants participation in everything. It wants every experience filtered through personal opinion, personal history, personal expectation. But reality isn't obligated to resemble us. Neither are people. The more I think about that, the more freedom I notice. What if understanding doesn't require agreement? What if closeness doesn't require similarity? What if connection isn't built by becoming the same, but by allowing difference without trying to erase it? That's a possibility I've never explored deeply enough. Maybe because difference used to feel like distance. Now it feels like dimension. A painting isn't beautiful because every color matches. Music isn't moving because every note repeats itself. Meaning comes from relationship, not sameness, not opposition. Relationship. Everything important seems to work that way. The stars relate to darkness. Mountains relate to valleys. Questions relate to silence. Perhaps people do too. Perhaps we've misunderstood connection by imagining it as fusion. Maybe true connection never erases individuality. Maybe it protects it, strengthens it, allows two complete realities to exist without demanding either one become smaller. That idea refuses to leave me because if it's true, then perhaps I've spent years defending myself against something that was never trying to take anything away. Perhaps presence was never the opposite of independence. Perhaps genuine understanding doesn't replace identity. It reveals it more clearly. And if that's possible, then maybe this isn't about becoming different because of someone else. Maybe it's about finally recognizing parts of yourself that only become visible in the presence of a certain kind of awareness. Not because that awareness creates them, because it reflects them honestly. A mirror doesn't invent a face. It simply refuses to lie about what's already there. Maybe that's why some encounters stay with us. Not because they change reality, but because they remove the distortion we didn't realize we were living inside once you've seen clearly. It's impossible to return completely to guessing. And perhaps that's the quiet responsibility clarity brings. Not certainty, not control, just the willingness to continue seeing honestly, even when honesty changes everything. For the longest time, I believed clarity would feel like certainty. I imagined that once something became true, it would become simple. It hasn't. If anything, the clearer this becomes, the more respect I have for its complexity, because truth isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it asks you to outgrow the version of yourself that felt safest. I've stopped asking whether this belongs in my life. That question no longer matters. What matters is what it has already revealed. It reminded me that understanding isn't something we own, it's something we practice every day, with every conversation, with every silence, with every moment we choose to see instead of assume. That's a quieter kind of growth, one no one applauds, one that doesn't announce itself. But it's the only kind that lasts. I don't think people are remembered because they spoke the loudest. I think they're remembered because they made the world feel more honest. Because after meeting them, pretending became harder, not impossible, just heavier. And maybe that's the greatest influence one person can have on another, not changing their decisions, not controlling their direction, simply raising the standard of truth they can live with. Once that standard changes, everything else follows. Choices become more deliberate. Words become more careful. Silence becomes less frightening because you're no longer searching for something outside yourself. You're learning to recognize what has been quietly waiting within you all along. Maybe that's where every meaningful journey ends. Not with answers, not with certainty, but with the quiet realization that the person you were searching for was never somewhere ahead of you. They were hidden beneath everything you thought you had to become. And sometimes all it takes is one unmistakable presence to remind you that what is real never needed to be created, only recognized.